Hey, good evening, everybody. Welcome to the second Managing the Planet for the fall semester of 2019. My name is Gene Kelly. I'm the faculty liaison at the School of Global Environmental Sustainability. I'm also in the College of Agricultural Sciences and love doing these events. Just some announcements for upcoming SOGIS events. The School of Global Environmental Sustainability has a lot of really great activities that go on, so check out the website, sustainability@coloradostate.edu. On November 7th at 4:30, Cities and Buildings Addressing Climate Change. That'll be at the Saunders Lecture Hall. Guest lecturer will be Ralph Nicola, CEO of New Buildings Institute. On November 14th from 6 to 8:30 p.m., this is a co-hosted event, Our Climate Future, celebrating 20 years of climate action in Fort Collins. And that will be at the Lincoln Center. I think that's the Lincoln Center. That got cut off there. That's Canyon West Room. It's a free event for the community. So those of you, that sounds like a live music, activities, free food. So that's good. Okay. So that's on November 14th from 6 to 8:30 at the Lincoln Center. So tonight we're gonna have an event talking about fires and specifically looking at the linkages between how climate change is contributing to these catastrophic fires. And so if you haven't been to a panel before, we have a group here from the Fort Collins High School. Why don't you guys all stand up? Stand up. Everybody give them a round of applause. Okay, you can sit down now. And then the other thing was that I heard you missed the last one because it was homecoming. What's that about? Come on. All right. Anyway, so all right. So anyway, so welcome aboard. But we're going to talk about climate change and how that's contributing to catastrophic fires. And the way that this works is I'll introduce the panelists. These are our experts from CSU that have varying degrees of expertise in areas of fire science and environmental sciences and climate change. And then they'll give some brief remarks. And then we'll open it up for questions, okay? And you can ask any kind of question, and we ask you to sort of identify yourself. So if you ask a question, you should tell us your name, and you get a plug. So if you'd like to plug something, you get to plug whatever you want to plug. And if I rip the mic out of your hand, you're not allowed to plug those things. So anyway, our first panelist is Dr. Camille Stevens-Runnan, is in the Department of Forest, Wildlife, and Rangeland Sciences, right? Is that what it is? FWRS, that's what
There's no W anymore.
Oh.
Forest and range.
I've been off campus too long, man. That's killing me. Okay. Camille's research focuses on ecosystem recovery, firing large disturbances, particularly fires. She teaches multiple classes for the program across campus and online. Her research addresses the challenges of disturbed lands, both basic in the understanding of species and ecosystem responses to disturbance, and applied for improving ecosystem management. Her research group utilizes multiple techniques, including observational field surveys, geospatial analysis, and experimental approaches. Welcome, Camille. It's your first panel.
It is.
Very good. Well, welcome aboard. So anyway, Francesca's been here 15 times, and she gets a ribbon tonight. I'm just kidding. Dr. Francesca, my colleague, Dr. Cortufo from Soils and Crop Sciences, is a soil ecologist, internationally recognized for her transformative work in organic matter dynamics. Her main research interest is in understanding the mechanisms and drivers of formation and persistence of soil organic matter. She studied the dynamics of pyrogenic organic matter, which we'll find out about that, on the High Park fire right out here in the Front Range. She also pursues applied research to propose soil management practices and amendments to improve soil health and mitigate climate change, such as biochar. So she's the biochar person from CSU. So welcome, Francesca, for being along with us. Okay, my other two colleagues, saving paper. Dr. Russ Schumacher. Russ is from the Department of Atmospheric Sciences, where he's a professor. Along with his faculty position, Russ, you might know, is the Colorado State climatologist and director of the Colorado Climate Center. So that's a pretty big job in addition to his academic duties. His research includes extreme precipitation, weather systems, mesoscale meteorology, climatology of precipitation, and social impacts of weather. He is a member of the faculty since 2011, and he received an NSF Career Award in 2010. Congratulations. He was also the outstanding professor voted by his students in 2012. Welcome aboard, Russ. Is this your first panel, too? Mm-hmm. We've got all these novices here. Anyway, okay. Finally, Dr. Terri Iverson from the Department of Economics is an environmental economist, macroeconomist who uses applied theory and numerical methods and economic tools to study issues of economics and climate change, other environmental problems. His ongoing research problem consists of looking at non-constant time preferences and equilibrium climate economy models. Oh my God. Anyway, and the study of urban development, also looking at sea level rise in different areas and the impacts of climate change on that. He also teaches graduate and undergraduate courses in environmental economics, including senior seminar and economics of climate change. So we have a really diverse panel tonight. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn it over to each of them, and we'll go left to right, and just about a minute or two, and the current issues you're working on and some things that you're interested in. Yeah.
Well, thanks for having me here. As Jean said, it's my first one of these, and I honestly am not at all an expert on fires, but so I'll just be kicking all of those questions to my esteemed colleagues here on that. But I do study weather and climate, and that both from sort of a research perspective and also in what we do in the Colorado Climate Center related to our mission that we kind of put into three parts of climate monitoring. So both, collecting climate data that other people are getting, as well as some of our own networks that some of you might be familiar with. Climate research, especially applied climate research and topics related to drought, which here in Colorado is quite well correlated to wildfires. And so that's one topic that's maybe relevant, and then climate services, which is when anybody from the public or an agency or wherever calls us up and needs weather or climate data related to something, then we fulfill that, or at least do our best to do that. So I think probably the reason that I'm here, I'm guessing, is related to, we've obviously had some very big wildfire years in Colorado over the last couple of decades, and especially related to the big droughts that we had in 2002, 2003, and then 2012 into 13, and then just last year. And at least here in Colorado, those droughts are correlate with our big wildfire seasons, and so that is something that we're always looking at, and especially in our office, we've been spending a lot of time trying to understand kind of the huge swings that we've had the last few years, going from an extremely dry 2017 into 18, the drought last year, and then an extremely wet, cool, snowy winter last year, right back into hot and dry again. And so we didn't have a huge fire year this year, but anyway, that's I guess a little bit about what I do, and
all right, Camille,
on down the line.
So I'm Camille, and I am a fire ecologist. So I feel like my big mission as a fire ecologist is to sell the message that not all fire is bad, because I feel like I get that question a lot, understandably, right? But a lot of my research kind of focuses on thinking about how ecosystems are coming back after fires, and thinking about if those climatic changes or climatic differences in that post-fire environment is really changing what it has the potential to come back on those landscapes. So that's a lot of what my research focuses on, and thinking about where we see changes across the landscape. If you're high up on the mountain or low down on the mountain, are you seeing different kind of community shifts and plant shifts as a result of that fire? And I also look at a lot of how different disturbances interact with one another, so how bark beetles perhaps are interacting with fires to change what those communities look like ultimately, as well as thinking about when we have that compounding effect of climate and fire, are we seeing different changes than we would have without that, those drought conditions or those hot, dry conditions that we might see now.
Okay, Terrence.
Hi, I'm Terri Iverson. I'm an economist in the economics department here. My research is on the economics of climate change. So most of, I guess, what economists think about in the context of climate change has to do with policy questions. How do you form policy that's maybe as effective as possible while being as cheap as possible, or having the least cost? But also, how do you create policies for, in this case, a global pollution problem where the harm that's being done spills across national borders, and you have to think about negotiating ultimately a kind of climate agreement among countries that are that can't force their will on other countries very easily because there's no international government that can allow us to do that. And so it creates a lot of challenges that economists have spent a lot of time thinking about and trying to design what they would call incentive-compatible treaties to achieve climate action at a kind of large scale, taking into account some of those challenges. So my research deals with some of those questions. I've also recently started thinking about some questions on the adaptation to climate change side. So I'm working with some other researchers thinking about the response of housing markets in coastal cities in response to rising sea level and rising storm surge risk, and thinking about opportunities for policy intervention to improve outcomes for people in those kinds of places. So as you probably guessed, I'm not an expert on fire risk. So I partly agreed to join the panel because I think having diverse perspectives makes for interesting conversation. So we'll see if that plays out.
Okay. Francesca.
Great to be here.
There you go.
Is it on now?
Yeah.
Great to be here, and great to be here with a school presence. Actually, my son is convincing me that Fort Collins High is the best school to go in Fort Collins. So I'm now gonna assess your question and see if that is true. I'm actually a soil biogeochemist, and if I have to say globally, what I'm most interested in is in what we call the carbon-climate feedback. So I work a lot on carbon in soil and understand how we can either sequester more carbon in the soil and mitigate climate change, or if by management or disturbance, carbon will go from the soil into the atmosphere. And so that's the kind of realm in which I'm interested in fire. I'm interested to understand whether when a fire occurs, it brings more carbon into the atmosphere in the short term, but then it also produces something that we call scientifically pyrogenic organic matter, but which basically is char, that is very recalcitrant. Microbes don't like it, so that carbon stays in the soil for centuries to millennia and can be an important mechanism of carbon sequestration. And we have analyzed many soils around the world, and there is a lot of char out there. In every soil has like 2% of a carbon minimum, up to 50 or 60% in char. And so that's where my interest is in understanding how fire impact the carbon climate feedback. See if there is for sure, the warm the climate goes and the more dry it goes, you have more fire, but will it be also a positive feedback to climate change or not? And I look at that from the standpoint of the soil and the pyrogenic carbon the fire produce and put into the soil. And we worked after the High Park fire. I don't know how many of you remember it, up in the foothills, and we monitored the pyrogenic carbon, how it went down into the river bank and then into the river. We had a lot of black waters at the time, and so we have been monitoring all that process.
Okay, great. Anyway, well, let's start. I'll start off with the first question. Since we sort of make this connection between climate change and fire, and I think the thing that we're hearing a lot of is something, the phrase is referred to as a mega fire. That, you know, if maybe this idea that fires were predictable at one time and now they're becoming unpredictable or whatever. Can somebody just address what do they mean by mega fire as opposed to what we've had sort of ordinary fires? Or Camille, anybody, or maybe want to jump on that? What's the driver of that? Why is that term used? Is it political? Is it real? Keith, get that out of my way. What are you doing? Oh, hey, okay, come on. Okay. God, I mean, it's like he's got the whole family here and everything. Go ahead.
Well, I would say a few years ago I went to a conference that was called Defining Megafires or something like that, I think. And I can't say we came up with a very good consensus of what is a megafire, because I think, it's a very human-centric perspective of what is a large fire, right? We can have one that has a very small footprint, right? Is only maybe a couple hundred acres, but if those couple hundred acres are burning down hundreds of houses, that's a lot of money, a lot of money lost, right? And has a lot of economic costs and consequences, and therefore, in that sense, might be considered a mega fire.
Okay.
There's also the perspective of different fires in different places are going to burn and produce different amounts of carbon. One of the things that we worry a lot about is things like the tundra burning, or places that just have a lot of soil or held carbon. Mm-hmm. And so if that fire is releasing way more than, say, a wildfire somewhere in the lower 48, even if it's not as large, it might be considered a mega fire.
Okay.
And then we think about those really huge fires, I like to give the perspective of I came from Idaho to here, and in Idaho, it's not uncommon in any given year to have a 200,000-300,000 acre fire. Or in Alaska or Canada, we're talking about maybe 1 million acre fire, right? Whereas the largest fire in Colorado's history is just over 100,000 acres. So, what we consider here in Colorado as a mega fire might be very different than what we would consider one in the in a different place, even in the U.S.
Okay, thanks. Okay, we're going to open it up now. You don't want me asking questions all night. It gets really boring. Here we go. Here's a question.
Hi, I'm Rick Bloss, and I'm an AP Environmental Science teacher at Fort Collins High. And I'll get my plug in, which is please vote yes on issue 4A on the November ballot to help teachers in pay equity. So I've been seeing prescribed burns in the newspaper. A recent one got out of control near Red Feather. As climate change is drying out different ecosystems, how is the management of prescribed burns going to change because they just might not be controllable anymore?
Okay.
Fire ecologist on the panel. Anyway.
So I would say that prescribed fires, there's always a risk, right? With or without climate change, there has been many unfortunate situations where those prescribed fires have gotten out of control. I think we have gotten a lot better as agencies and institutions of working across boundaries to try to be better at controlling them and finding easy access points. For a long time, we all stood in our silos of the Forest Service doing one thing and the Park Service doing another while homeowners did another. And I think there's been a lot of effort, especially here, like on the Front Range, where there is a lot of mixed use and private landowners next to a lot of Forest Service and public land, to make strides towards trying to manage where it makes the most sense instead of where those artificial boundaries are in a lot of cases. Not to say, obviously, that that's foolproof, but I think that that's the only way. I don't think the solution is then to not have fires, right? We live in burnable landscapes, and so the only way to prevent the next catastrophically large, intense mega fire is by managing these landscapes with things like prescribed fire. And I think that it's a way we're getting better at managing the ways that we address that risk.
Okay. Anybody else? Francesca.
Yeah, I want to make sure that we don't see prescribed fire as an enemy or a risk. For sure, they need to be done well and minimize the risk. But prescribed fire can be a very important management mechanism, in particular also in grasslands, for example. They stimulate productivity. They can be integrated. There is an idea of doing patch burn with adaptive grazing. And so for sure, the use of fire can be a good thing that control ecosystem, and so the reason why this mega fire are happening, or it's because they have gone out of hand, also because we stopped a lot of fire, and so trying to manage fire well in an integrated way with all the other management practice is actually an important thing that we need to figure out.
Okay, Russ.
Yeah, just like sort of the novice point of view on that question. The Society of Environmental Journalists had their big conference here at CSU a couple of weeks ago, and they had a tour up to the foothills to see the High Park fire area. And we went to the Boy Scout ranch. I went on that tour, and we went to the Boy Scout ranch, and they were actually supposed to start the prescribed burn that day, but that was the day that it snowed. And so obviously it was postponed, but part of this was learning from the folks at the Nature Conservancy that were doing that. And I mean, and they talked about how this was months of planning, and they were very, very concerned that things did not, they knew that where Glacier View was, obviously, and that it didn't get there. And I don't really know the details of what ended up happening, but it was, it was just sort of sad to see that this isn't like a thing that's done just, go out and light some stuff on fire. Like, this is months of planning and all the agencies involved and all the right people, and things obviously still can happen, but that was kind of a new learning experience for me of how that all works, and obviously the weather ties closely into all of this.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Question.
Hi, my name's Sandra, and I'm part of CSU's Animal Cancer Center, which has nothing to do with here, but that's my plug. I'm actually here because I recently bought a property in southern Colorado in Saguache, and the Decker fire is outside of the Salida area, and I'm just trying to wrap my head around, I think as just a member of the community, I hear prescribed, and I think it's highly planned. It's through established guidelines, but it sounds like who can say they're doing a prescribed burn? Because I didn't know the Nature Conservancy could do their planned one, but then there's other groups, and are there standards, and should we hear the word prescribed and think, oh, well, then it's fine? If something goes wrong, it's because, well, those things can happen, but it feels like they're happening a lot in the past 2 months.
Yeah.
Question.
So the Decker fire is not a prescribed, or didn't start as a prescribed fire. It's what we would call, well, it goes through many different terms in the last few years, but something like wildfire use or wildfire for resource benefit. So it started as a wildfire in the wilderness, and so the U.S. has a mandate to allow wilderness areas to burn in a natural way if they're naturally caused, right? Because we're trying to get back to kind of a natural land management process. Because the alternative, really, if you think about all the restrictions you have to doing things in wilderness, right? You can't ride a bike, you're not supposed to take motorized vehicles, et cetera, et cetera. Well, as a firefighter, what that means is that you're now fighting that fire with a crosscut saw. And you're hiking in there or getting dropped off by helicopter and then hiking out. And so it presents a lot of risk to firefighters. And obviously there's exceptions that get made. We have fought lots of wildfires in wilderness areas. But there has been a push to try to get at least those areas that we are trying to manage as being completely natural, to allow these natural processes to happen. And so that was kind of the initial intent with that fire, is to allow it to burn. Wherever it goes, allow it to burn with some contingency points. And so I think what happened with that fire is that it got to those contingency points and then became, the weather conditions changed so that it was it impacted communities. And so that, I would say in that case, that's kind of an opportunistic use of fire versus a prescribed fire that is much more planned. You have to have the right weather window so that you're not smoking out a whole community. You have to have, that has a whole NEPA process for a prescribed fire, things like that. So it is much more controlled. You know exactly where those boundaries are going to be. So there's a few differences there, and I think, wildfire use, I think there's benefits and downsides to it, but ultimately, if we think about the fact that we are really effective at putting out wildfires, right? So all the ones that make the news, that's 2% of the wildfires that start in the U.S. Not the other 98% are put out by about 10 a.m. the following day after they start, which means that other 98% could be used in something like that resource benefit because they're burning in these less extreme conditions. And so that's what they tried to do with that Decker fire, is manage it in a way to allow a larger footprint to be managed than we can really achieve even with a prescribed fire.
Okay, we got a question back here.
Thank you. Whoa. My name's Colton. I'm a high school student here in town and fascinated by wildland fires. My question for you guys is, you were talking about fire use and how it's been something that's used to like clear out forests and whatever. How often do those fires that are put on like monitor fire use status get out of hand and turn into things like the Decker fire? If you know.
Yeah, I can't say I know the percentage on that. I would say that it's probably a fairly small percentage, right? Again, just like we hear about the 2% of fires that become large events, I would say that it's probably a fairly similar number that are use fires that impact a community in some negative way.
And one thing to consider when we say prescribed fire, I don't know how many of you have walked in the mountains these days, but there are also a lot of basically pine beetle killed wood that now are put together into pile, and when is a good opportunity, weather-wise, a good window, they burn them. And that is different from a prescribed fire. And in a way, that's something that the Forest Service is the best they thought they could do with the problem of the pine beetle. But for example, we have researched other use and better use of that. So I think it's important also to separate what is a prescribed fire in order to maintain a specific condition in an ecosystem versus burning piled wood because we don't know how. What is a better economic way of using it? And again, we have done research that find out that there are better economic ways of using that wood, but that has not been put in place yet.
Yeah, I'll just interject a unprofessional thought and say, I can only imagine that what I don't know, thinking about this from an economic perspective, that a big part of the managerial incentives are that anybody in an authoritative position to authorize a prescribed fire is at massive risk of having to take the fall when it turns out badly. So I can only imagine that a big part of this is that it's very hard to actually do prescribed fires, even though ecologists and such know that it's a good idea and we should be doing them regularly. So I can imagine that's a big part of this.
Yeah, I would say that that's a huge hurdle to overcome, right? If you're the person that says, yes, let's go ahead and manage it this way, you are taking on that risk as a person. Obviously within an institution, whether that's the Nature Conservancy or the Forest Service, but you're personally taking on that risk. And I know I know several careers that have been gone down the drain for decisions like that that have been made. But you know, that also, that's good and bad, right? That makes people very cautious, and so these kind of catastrophic situations happen a lot less frequently. But it also makes us very fire averse, right? And I think that's something that here in Colorado we are particularly fire averse because of different incidents that have happened that we all can think about and remember, especially here on the Front Range. And so I think that you know, even when you think about someplace like New Mexico, there's a lot less kind of community mental blocks to allowing fires to burn on a landscape than there are here, I would say.
We have a question back here.
Hi, my name's Wally, and I'm a retired CDOT employee. And my question gets more to the issue of risk management and the economics of that issue. The risks of living in areas where fires occur is so prominent in this area, obviously. Our family lived for 5 years west of Durango, about 7 miles up at 7,500 feet elevation in the Ponderosa Pine. It was like to die for. It's beautiful. And yet, when we were down there in '02, you may recall there was some significant fires burning in the area, and our subdivision wasn't directly affected, fortunately, but we sure felt the risk of that. And then we moved up here, and then in 2012, of course, we see flames burning off to the west over here. So it's like we've been through this a bit, and smelled the smoke directly, and my office down there was not far from where fires were burning as well. So the personal risk and the societal decisions that we make in terms of where we allow land uses to occur that are of great potential harm by fire is a big deal. These decisions need to be looked at, I think, much more carefully in terms of land use and policy. And I guess maybe that's sort of an economics question, but I mean, it's one of those things that if we don't start changing our thinking and trying to react better in terms of how we allow land uses that are subject to fire in certain areas, I think the cost will be more significant, and who bears those costs? It's all of us basically at this time. But I think we need to be looking at that a little more carefully, but I'd like a perspective on that from anyone. And what do you think the future is of how we as a society can balance out the risk management of this issue of fire?
Terry, you want to grab that one?
Yeah, I'll try to take a little stab. So from an economic perspective, I think, in fact, it's interesting. The problem is similar in structure to thinking about people building homes at sea level right now. So there's sort of this wildland-urban interface, and there's a risk that an individual is undertaking by building in a place that has higher risk. I think that from an economic perspective, the sort of inefficiency arises when there's effectively an implicit government subsidy for that. So in the case of wildfire risk, if the government is committed to protecting those houses and incurring lots of risked firefighter lives and resource expenses, et cetera, they're doing that in response to somebody locating in a place, but typically the person who builds there isn't helping to pay that cost, maybe. So in the case of sea level rise, that happens because we basically subsidize flood insurance for coastal development. So you get massive development along the coasts, and in 100 years, that coastline's going to look a lot different. And the government's sort of committed to helping defray the cost of insurance and allowing people to sort of rationally make decisions to invest there. But there's a problem with that. So I think it's the same thing in the fire case. I'm not actually an expert on that discussion or the nature of to what extent the insurance that people are required to pay in those situations cover the costs that are incurred. But I think that's ultimately the question. I don't know if you know more about that.
Yeah, so I think we've been slowly changing our mentality around that. So before, you could get insurance on your property, regardless of whether you did thinning or if you were in a very fire-prone area. And that has slowly been changing in part because of all of the large wildfires in California, and that some insurance companies have almost gone bankrupt as a result of those fires, trying to pay back for all of those homes that have been burned. But I think kind of the other extreme from that on the firefighting perspective is that, you can look at some place like Australia, which for a long time had a stay and defend policy, which basically was, if you choose to move out into a wildland urban interface and you choose to build a house there, and a wildfire comes by, you're welcome to stay and defend your own home. We're not going to make you evacuate, but we're also not going to do anything to help you. Which they have subsequently changed because there was a lot of fatalities of homeowners as a result of that policy. But I think we can look at those kind of two comparisons, right? We're losing a lot of lives and a lot of resources. That's all on the homeowner's side. Whereas here, the vast majority of firefighter fatalities happen while defending that urban interface. Because, am I going to risk my life for another tree? Well, I mean, I love trees, don't get me wrong, but probably not, right? Whereas if it's my neighbor's house or somebody that I'm close to, or even I just know that these people care about their property, I'm probably going to take that extra risk, which results in a lot of burnovers and fatalities and injuries from firefighters. So I think I don't know if we've quite got that trade-off perfectly yet, but I think there's some medium ground where, we should be accepting that risk as a group, as a society or a government, but also there should be a lot more ownership on people who choose, especially not to do anything when they choose to move there, right? We all like to see our trees when we're at our cabin or at our beautiful mountain home. But if that's not the right thing for preventing fire spread, we need to be more active in combating that.
Terry, good. Well, go ahead.
Well, yeah, one just response thought. There might be like you were talking about people paying insurance for the property, but there's also the couple $2 billion a year that the federal government spends on fire control that could also be passed on to the people in high risk urban areas. I'm not necessarily prescribing that actually, but that would be a portion of what a cost that's not being passed on to them maybe.
Yeah, Russ.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is to where, like, the topic of tonight is climate change, how that plays into all of this, and all of the issues you all were just discussing are issues sort of regardless of whether the climate's changing or not. But then we also know that it's going to get warmer, and probably there's impacts there, and exactly what fraction that is going to play versus these other things that we're talking about. But now we're sort of somehow multiplying these things together, probably in a way we don't understand very well, I'm guessing, and whether individuals or insurance companies or whoever, I'm sure they're thinking about it, but what you kind of actually decide on, maybe things that there isn't a lot of historical precedent for is not something I know a lot about, but I imagine this is a huge part of the equation.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting observation and related. I mean, what's partly happening, I suspect, is that the risks are changing over time and getting riskier, and you have lots of development along this wildland urban interface where it's going to get riskier and riskier over time. And thinking about how the government responds to that. Do we just ramp up more and more and more protection of everything, or at some point do we change the incentives so people are required to move out of those places? I don't know.
Right. Okay, I got a question over here.
Yeah, my name's Ken. I'm just a citizen here. It's my understanding that climate change had a lot to do with the beetle infestation, the bark beetles, and that caused a lot of more propensity for fire in the forest. Is that like over? Did that run its course, and are the beetles finished, or is there anything coming that climate change is affecting that could have this similar effect?
So some of the indirect effects of climate change on fire, and somebody want to go after the pine beetle thing?
Maybe you know better than I. So yes, the idea is that for sure, in particularly for insects, the fact that we are not having very severe cold days in the winter, they enhance the population of insects that then can attack those trees, and also the fact that because of prevention of fire or non-thinning, the fact that the trees are very densely populated, they can spread that insect outbreak very easily. So yes, it's not directly, I'm a soil ecologist, so maybe somebody else might correct me. But my understanding is that the pine beetle outbreak has definitely been favored by warming climate, in particular in the winter. That spread has kind of come to a plateau, and now we are seeing the end of that phase. But there is now the spruce outbreak, and so that's the other thing that took the pine, but now the spruce seems to be affected from a different beetle, and so I think that with climate change, we are going to see more and more of these events, and we can't imagine that it's just a one-time thing and then it will be over.
Okay.
I would
Camille.
only quickly add that, if you think about what those populations look like, right? You have to have a host. You have to have trees that are living. And so you're going to see a potentially huge increase in bark beetles, in part because of climate change. And then you're going to run out of trees, right? Which is basically why the pine beetle, and lodgepole pine especially, has kind of run its course. And we're getting to that kind of loss of hosts with spruce as well in some places. And I think what's important to remember with those things is that it is a cyclical cycle, and it has always been a cyclical cycle of ups and downs with bark beetle outbreaks, because these are native species. We're not talking about an invasive species in this case. There's always been pine beetles, there's always been spruce beetles out there. The magnitude in which they're affecting the forest is probably, perhaps unprecedented at least in more in the last several 100 to 1,000 years. But that is kind of a natural cycle. I think one of the big things that that's concerning when we think about climate change is whether or not these systems are getting hit over and over again by these multiple disturbances that's happening too quick for them to recover, right? If you get hit by a large outbreak by bark beetles, but you have plenty of time to grow back and become a mature forest again, then it's not as big of a concern. But if suddenly you have another fire or an invasive species come in and take over where those trees were, that's when it starts to get not dicey. Let's put it that way.
Okay, question back here.
Hi, so I'm Peter Bachland from SOGIS, and Russ just brought up the kind of overall pressure of climate change pushing on these nested set of issues that a lot of you have been describing. And what I'm curious about is we've already seen, these climate change impacts most obviously in the really significant extension of the fire season. And so is there an adequate management response to that? I know that federal expenses for fighting fire have gone way, way up. But you referenced earlier that kind of 98% to 2% ratio of well-controlled versus uncontrolled. Is that ratio stable, or is that changing? Do we have a good understanding of how that's changed over time, and can we see a climate change signal on that? Is it resulting in more uncontrolled fires, or is it just that the uncontrolled fires are getting worse?
Okay.
Yeah, so it is a percentage, right? So we're not talking about a number of acres burned being 2% or 98%. So as far as I understand, that 98% is staying fairly stable, at least for the last 30 years or so, since we've been tracking this pretty consistently across federal agencies. What I would say is that 2%, when we're talking about a huge fire year that's now, the largest fire year that the United States has ever had, that 2% means many more acres burned. And in terms of management, I think basically the only response, at least on the federal side for managing that, has been to increase the budget, like you said, to fighting fire, to suppression, which has come, unfortunately, at the cost of the rest of the Forest Service's budget, right? So I think right now we're hovering around 54% of the Forest Service's budget is for specifically fire suppression, which means that maybe during that wildfire event you're being managed really well, but that also means that there's less and less money available to do things like prescribed fire and treatments, thinning treatments and things like that. And so I think that's one of those shifts that really needs to happen in terms of how we're thinking about managing these large fires, is what can we do before they happen that's going to change the way they grow, right? And the way that they become these large events. If we're managing much larger amounts of those landscapes prior to that large fire, we have a much greater chance of mitigating that large event even happening.
Right. Russ, I have a question. So do you ever sit back and look at your weather stuff and just go, oh, here it comes, it's fires? Can you, are you there? Does your agency sort of have that capacity, and do you work really closely with the federal agencies? Or what? To me, it would seem like you're sitting there on top of everything going, oh man, here it goes,
Well, so this is actually like a huge thing that's just happened in basically in the last month. That in California, PG&E is shutting people's power off as a result of weather forecasts, not as a result of the fires already happening. It's we can see these conditions coming, and regardless of what you think about
Power
that decision,
lines
whether
down,
that's the right way to do it, I think as in our field, we're sort of like, oh wow, we actually, I mean, partly like, yeah, things have progressed well enough to do this, but also like people are like putting lots and lots of money and their livelihoods like on the weather forecasts, and
That's
so
right.
that's sort of a responsibility that we probably haven't had to quite that extent previously when it comes to fires. But that's just to kind of maybe draw a little distinction between that, that California situation. I guess those fires are in this time of year when they get the Santa Anas or the Diablo winds is fairly predictable. I think here in Colorado is maybe a little bit harder to kind of pin those days down because, the example I always think of is the Waldo Canyon fire in 2012 that it was outflow wind gusts from thunderstorms that developed out in the San Juans and kind of tracked across the state and then got to Colorado Springs and down the slope and shifted the wind direction and the speed and took the fire from, up in the foothills down into the neighborhoods. And that, I mean, that's a little bit predictable, but maybe hours in advance, not days in advance. So it's, it's maybe where you can get a little bit out ahead of it and protect firefighters and things like that, but not, I think those kinds of situations are not where we're going to be, making big decisions days in advance.
Okay. Question over here.
Yeah, with what we know about climate change and the climate crisis and the impact it is having on the intensity in the growth of wildfires, how do we use that information to talk with folks that live in those areas that have to make the changes in their lives that probably are gonna have to make? I remember the last session that was here, a month or so ago, the speakers talked a lot about messaging and how we did that. And I guess I'm interested in hearing how to do that because I live there. I worked on the last fire and I spent 48 hours with those people that lit the fire. Bravo. So I know what those people are going through. But how do we take because we're all in here, we all understand, we all accept the science. We know what the impacts are. But a lot of the folks out there that are living in the environment, even within the fire community of which I'm part of, don't really understand that and are still kind of in a little bit of denial of that. So what would be your advice to us on how we create those messages?
Okay. Let's go. Okay, everybody should have a comment on that one.
I mean, I feel like so I would first say that I'd love to give you a perfect answer, and I think that there is a lot of great research out there that could probably point you in better directions than I can give you right in a few seconds. But I think one of the big things is that we all accept a certain amount of risk, right? Like I rode my bike here without a helmet. Oh, that was a risky thing to do, right?
Bad idea.
I know. I couldn't find it. Didn't want to be late.
Okay.
So when we talk about wildfires, I think one of the things that a lot of people make decisions on is, it's really unlikely for me to have a fire, right? I see that somebody else's place burned or something like that, but it's probably unlikely that my property is going to be impacted, right? And so I think that one of the big things in that messaging is that no, there is an increased likelihood. Like you're probably going to have a fire, not maybe you will. And I think that like shift in a mentality of like, I need to do something on this like off chance that something happens, right? I need to take my vitamin every day, but I may live to 90 even if I don't, right? Versus like, well, if I don't do this, then I'm definitely going to lose my house. It's kind of that shift of perspective that I think as we all become more aware of these wildfires that are impacting our communities, we get better at acknowledging that risk is really there. But I think that's one of the big things in the messaging is that it's not a what if, it's when.
Hey, Russ.
My research background is more in like extreme precipitation and floods, and so we often, the 100-year storm or whatever often comes up in that context, and we know that there's lots of problems with that sort of communication because it gives you that impression that it's super rare and it's unlikely. And so I think a lot of people in that area have been trying to well, okay, so let's look at it over the course of, say, a 30-year mortgage. If you own a home, a 30-year mortgage, you've got a 26% chance of having a 100-year rainstorm at your spot, over a 30-year period. And that's a lot more tangible there. I mean, and that assumes that we know what the 100-year storm is and things like that. And so, I mean, I don't know how effective that is either, because it's still getting into numbers and details. But I think the other thing, from the disasters research is that the memory of these things fades pretty quickly.
Yeah.
I mean, within a couple of years, and I don't know how to counteract that, but that, I think it's, if there's some decisions that need to be made or whatever, or messaging that needs to happen, it probably needs to happen shortly after the event happens, not 5 years later.
Right. Yeah. Terry.
Yeah, well, and related to that, in the kind of risk perceptions side of things, I think people have a lot harder time anticipating dynamic changes in risk over time than, when the historical risk that they've seen in their recent time isn't likely to obtain in 10 years, and I think that's a huge problem that I don't know the answer to, but
Yeah. That's where's Smokey Bear when we needed him? It's like not around anymore. Anyway, let me get a question over here, and I'll get this one right there. Okay.
I'm John Calderazzo, writer and retired CSU English professor. So a related question about messaging or information. When, let's say, 200 or 300 firefighters are going to be put into the forest somewhere when the fire has broken out, is there enough information readily available to the proper agencies so that when they go in, they might know that the eastern side of where they're going in is, 80% browned out trees and so forth, but maybe the western side is just 20%. Do we have enough information to give to firefighters or their commanders to know what they're going into in ever-changing conditions?
Yeah, I think that I think that's something that we're getting better at explaining or having that information readily available, because we have experienced firefighter fatalities, especially around bark beetles. That firefighters walk into a stand that's full of a whole bunch of dead trees, and then they start falling down on them. So I think that's something that we have gotten better at. It really varies by district and forest as to how knowledgeable even those forest managers are in regards to some of those things, right? If you're managing a really huge district in a kind of remote forest that nobody is really at a whole lot of the time, you may not have that same amount of information that you're going to have like here on the Pike or the Roosevelt or something like that, where there's a lot more people out in the forest and where those risks are. And I think that that's something, the Rocky Mountain Research Station here, as well as even the Forest Service based out of Fort Collins, is doing a lot of trying to be better about thinking proactively about where contingency lines and fire lines can be, instead of thinking about that in the moment. Like, I can't tell you as a firefighter how many times I dug line or tried to put out the fire and then it burned over and over again. You're just doing this repetitive, mind-numbing work that it has no effect. And so I think we're trying to get better about being really strategic about where we put resources and making it in places that there's good hold points to prevent that increased risk to people, for sure.
Okay. Francesca.
I like to go back to what was discussed before about the messaging and maybe about all the questions that have come up to now, which seems to have the worry of the fire mostly in relation to us and our houses and our life if we are firefighters, and so all very legitimate things. But one thing that I would like to put out there is that maybe we should also start discussing fire in the context of climate change, the same way in which discuss the glaciers that are melting and things like that. So fire can actually have a big feedback on the climate. And the fact that fires, we said, are natural in a lot of places, but the fact that the toxic the permafrost and a lot of places up in the Arctic that have never experienced fire before in the past decades have experienced severe fire, or the huge fire that we have seen this summer in the Amazon. Those are going to have a huge positive feedback on climate change in the short term. There are scientific evidence that through the pyrogenic carbon and stuff on the centennial or millennial time scale that actually can be carbon sink the fire, but in the time frame that is interested to us, which is decades, fire emit a ton of carbon into the atmosphere. And so I think that besides our legitimate worry about our houses in the forest and the life of firefighters, we should really start messaging about the fact that fires can be a huge feedback on climate change, and trying to get a better understanding of how to try and limit those fires.
Okay, question here.
Hi, my name is Audrey Sweetland, and I'm just a student at CSU, and I'm just kind of piggybacking off the question of the behavioral shifts in fires being more intense, more frequent seasons, and larger fires, and I was just wondering, like, what is like the exact, Francesca kind of touched on a little bit, what like the exact climate feedback looks like in sort of a quantifiable metric, I suppose.
Good.
Yeah, so the way in which you can quantify the feedbacks to climate change is to see how much of the carbon that was in the biosphere get emitted directly into the atmosphere, how much become pyrogenic carbon and goes into the soil, and how long it's going to stay, but also how after that fire you can regenerate a community that can continue uptake carbon from the atmosphere, and whether they do it more or less efficiently than before. So it's not a straightforward way of calculating how a fire will increase or decrease the carbon budget of an ecosystem. But generally, the idea is that in the short term of the years to a decade, the carbon is a net emission of carbon. The fire is a net emission of carbon into the atmosphere. Once you go after the decade, in particularly if you have a very fast regeneration of that ecosystem, and you can have a lot of drawdown of carbon in the new vegetation, and if you get a lot of pyrogenic carbon formed and sequestered in the soil, then it can turn out being a sink. So if you look at fire on a maybe centennial time scale, are quantified to be carbon sink. But if you look them on a decadal time scale, they are definitely carbon sources. And since for us the next 10 years are going to be critical to the future of our planet, the fact that we have so many big fires today, it means that there is a lot of CO2 that was on land that is going into the atmosphere, which is the total opposite of what we need.
Question back here.
Hi, thank you. My name is Jennifer Tobin. I'm the Deputy Administrator of the Natural Hazards Center at CU Boulder. And so I have a couple comments. First, I want to say thank you to Sojus. Thank you. Thanks, Sojus, for putting together this great, diverse panel from multiple disciplines. I have one comment for your comment, which was about wildfire adaptation and homeowners. And we have a researcher at CU Boulder, Hannah Brankart-Smith, who's been doing some great research on how people change their behaviors based on what their neighbors' behaviors are. And when you get to a certain threshold of so many neighbors taking positive change to reduce their wildfire risk, then other neighbors will also follow suit. So look into her work. I'll be happy to give you her information. And also I have another question related to that, which is, can you talk a little bit more about what specific things people can do to mitigate their homes and their businesses if they're living in these dangerous areas, given that we know that the risk is going to increase over time? Thank you.
Thanks. Anybody want to address that?
Yeah, so there's quite a bit of literature out there for those of you who want to find specifics about your specific home or what you should be doing in your landscape. There is some great literature that the state of Colorado puts out about being fire-wise. I think as we think about climate change and all of this, there is also a critical piece of that going from just thinking about protecting your home to all of your acres to getting your neighbors involved and things like that, right? You can do all the work that do it perfectly at your house. But if that fire has 100-foot flame lengths and is coming from your neighbor's property that is not thinned, and nothing has been done, then it doesn't matter what you have done. It's probably going to hit your house anyway. And I think that's kind of what we've been seeing with some of those bigger fires in California, where we're not really talking about a fire burning from tree to tree and then happening to ignite the house closest to it. We're talking about ignitions from house to house, right? When that fire that happened in Paradise, California last fall, that's exactly what happened. You can actually see some of those aftermath pictures where the trees are standing and look fine next to a completely burned down house, right? Because that fire was initiating from house to house. It wasn't no longer kind of moving through the trees. And so I think when we think about how we should be managing our personal properties, it needs to be not just thinking about making that defensible space right around the building itself, but how is that larger landscape going to look if a fire comes through?
Okay,
but there's a lot of great resources out there.
Okay, question.
Hi, my name's Wyatt. I am aspiring wildland firefighter, student of fire. So my question is in regards to, so we see a lot of fire in more of the western part of the United States. And in regards to climate change, are we starting to see, or will we see fire spread to less fire-prone areas, as in further east where they might become more common, or in areas where it's generally more humid?
I mean, I would say yes to some degree. I would also say that we have a lot more unmanaged landscapes in the western U.S., which is a big part of the reason why wildfires are more prevalent here, right? When you're talking about historic grasslands, those burned way more frequently than forests, but now they're all farms, right? And so that's going to have a really different thing when we're talking about the plains versus a wilderness area in Colorado burning. When we definitely are seeing fires into areas that we haven't in the past, like you mentioned tundra fires, or boreal ecosystems that maybe burned at less frequent basis. We could also look at places like our alpine ecosystems here in Colorado, right? Those fuels are becoming more readily available to burn for longer parts of the season, which is why they are burning, right? Before maybe they were uncovered by snow for 1 month out of the year. Now we're looking at a couple months to a few months out of the year that they're uncovered from snow, which makes that fuel available to burn. And so I think we are seeing that shift in some places. But I would say also that the Southeast burns a lot, and they love their prescribed fire. So let's not downplay how frequently some ecosystems burn. We're talking about those ecosystems in the Southeast being adapted to burn every 1 to 3 years historically in some places,
Right.
which is way more frequent than we burn here.
All right, question over here.
Hi, I'm Paige I'm a grad student at CSU. And I have a question specifically for Francesca. When we're talking about net carbon from fires and it's positive in the short term, are there characteristics of fires that minimize that? So when we talk about if we're doing prescribed burns and we want to minimize how much carbon we're putting into the atmosphere, can we do burns in a certain way that minimize what goes out there, like certain lengths of the fire in a specific area or heat of it? Are there any ways that we can do that?
Yes, so for sure the temperature of the fire is determine the amount of pyrogenic carbon that is produced versus CO2 or methane that is produced into the atmosphere. And so in generally, the highest the temperature, the more gets burned. But on the other hand, the more of the carbon that remain is what we say condensed in aromatic form that stay for a long time. And so if you do low temperature burning, you emit less, but the carbon that stays is slightly modified from a normal biomass. And so it can be still decomposed by microbes, and it can still go through the regular processes that biomass goes to a certain extent. And so we say what is the temperature continuum from 200 to 1,000 or above, and that again, you increase the amount of emission, but also you increase the permanence of what stays, and we discuss what is better.
Okay.
Taken into account in prescribed burns at all?
I don't think so.
Okay.
Not that I know of.
Okay, question over here.
Hi, I'm Andreas. I'm a grad student here as well. And I've got kind of a Terri question. I'm thinking about PG&E right now. I had this question a few weeks ago when they shut off a ton of power to California, and now it's happening again tonight. And on one hand, it's kind of incredible that we have climatologists talking to people on the ground to anticipate these sorts of events and hopefully try to mitigate some of it. But at the same time, there's this huge cost to millions of people in California if you just turn off the power for 5 days at a time, 5 times a year. And they say, yeah, maybe, until we update the grid, this might be another 10 years of this. Are there any really clear solutions that don't take 10 years? I mean, when you look at this problem, like, what do you see as kind of is there an obvious answer here? Should we put solar panels on the roof of everyone in California, or is this really like a fundamental, infrastructure problem that a lot of the West, do you think, is going to have to deal with?
Thanks for directing that question at me. I think it's an excellent question. I mean the current electricity grid is dated in lots of different ways and desperately needs to be overturned. This might be another example of that. But I don't have a good idea of an alternative to what's going on right now. And I don't know enough about the considerations to be able to say anything. But certainly I think hopefully, over the next 20 years we're gonna switch away from being entirely dependent on large fossil fuel production and moving towards more distributed energy. But anybody else have any thoughts?
Francesca,
Paradox
comment?
of that California thing is that our colleagues, scientific, they had their field sites with all their sensors and everything, to address the effect of climate change, and all the sites shut down because they had to shut down the electricity.
Question over here.
I'm Jan Peterson. I'm an architect, so I can tell you that if you go to the state website, they have a wonderful guide on how to deal with the wildfire threat if you're living in the mountains or rural Colorado. Lots of very specific guidelines. I'm also on the board of directors at Poudre Valley REA, and knock on wood, we have never caused a fire, but we have been subject to a number of fires, starting with the big one back in 2012. And since then, there have been half a dozen fires that have impacted us, and they've almost all, well, a couple of lightning strikes, but human-caused fires. Somebody has a piece of equipment that strikes a rock and makes a spark, and the grass catches fire, and it just spreads. A car burns on the roadside. It sparks a fire that just spreads. We have lost numbers of poles and transmission lines because of problems like that. Today, I read an article, probably an opinion piece, that was talking about how economists routinely underestimate the issues of, or the economic impacts of climate change. Number one, because, well, scientists can't tell them what the impacts are going to be because they don't know, it's uncertain, so that's understandable. But number two, they estimate things based on past experience. And what we are headed into is nothing like past experience. And then number three, climate change has ramifications, tipping points, multiple impacts that are going to interact with one another that typically make things worse, not better. And so for all of these reasons, economic estimates of the damage caused by climate change are woefully inadequate. Since we understand this, how can economists start giving us better answers to the problems of climate change so that people who are only motivated by economics will feel an urgency to make change happen?
I have a feeling that question was directed at me. So I think it's a very good question. So as I think I understand it, the criticism is that economists are say understating what damages are likely to be from climate change. So maybe to sort of make it more concrete, I think there's a famous economist from Yale who won the Nobel Prize in Economics last year, William Nordhaus, who's often disliked by environmentalists and seen as someone who's sort of in the middle of the road in trying to and he's basically spent his career quantifying the costs and benefits of global intervention on climate change. And I would definitely say that there's a bias towards he's conservative in the sense of like, what are there published studies that I can use as a basis for quantifying real damages? So in his model that he works with, he focuses on sort of what he thinks to be the 7 biggest large categories of damages and adds up all the impacts of various changes. Of course, most of those studies have to do with temperature changes that aren't very far from where we are today, because we don't have any observations on things that are further out in the temperature distribution. And so what economists do is basically heroically fit some polynomial function to higher temperature impacts as a basis for having a coherent, logical exercise about the problem, or think about it coherently. And then there's other economists who argue, no, that's not correct. It should be this. Unfortunately, we don't have. It's very hard to adjudicate a debate between those alternative perspectives because it's outside the scope of what we observe. So I think on the one hand, it's almost certainly true. Whatever I can't remember offhand the Donald Rumsfeld quote, but there's the known unknowns, and then there's the unknowns that we don't know, right? And in climate change, that will almost certainly be true. It's going to be things that we don't fully understand now. I mean, 15 years ago, people weren't thinking about ocean acidification, and now we realize that that's going to be a colossally impactful, global ecological catastrophe. Basically, the oceans turning more acidic as more carbon dioxide is absorbed into the oceans, and that's something we didn't know about previously. So I think it's a hard. And it's a tricky discussion. So I think Nordhaus has partly been effective at having a continued impact on this sort of policy relevant debate because he's always tried to be conservative in what he says. But a lot of economists have argued that he's too conservative and understating, or economists and otherwise, other people have argued that he's too conservative. What I would say, so my maybe reframing of this debate, if you look at the sort of Nordhaus-based models or similar models in the economics of climate change, they tend to argue that we need to do quite a bit about climate change, and it should get more and more aggressive as time goes on. It's less aggressive than maybe we have to hit a 1.5 or 2 degree centigrade temperature target when you net out costs and balances, but those are costs and benefits, but those are open questions, and those are big debates. The way I sometimes describe this to my students, though, it's sort of like there's economists and other people, but arguing about, it's like you could think of if the goal was to like fill a bathtub, and we're arguing, should we fill the bathtub to here, or should we fill the bathtub to here, or should we fill the bathtub to here? And there's a debate, and you could make different assumptions about a damage function in these kinds of models that economists use, and you might argue, the conclusion might be we should fill the bathtub to here or to here. The truth is we don't even have a drain in the bathtub. So that debate about should we fill the bathtub to here or to here is an important debate, but it's not the most important debate. We're not even starting to move. And so, global carbon emissions are growing year over year. So it's a permanent pollutant that's staying in the atmosphere for hundreds and thousands of years. And we need to eventually get carbon emissions down to zero. They're at 35 billion tons a year globally and rising. And according to the DICE model that Nordhaus uses, without any policy intervention, emissions will be on the order of 100 billion tons of carbon emissions by the end of the century. So that's the path that we're on. That's the path that, so we need to find the plug, and that's partly about figuring out how to have a global climate agreement that has countries with enough incentives that they're going to follow through on what they say they're going to do, and that's a big discussion. But I'll stop there.
Great. Okay. Question over here. One right there.
Hi, I'm Cassie Archuleta, and I work in air quality with the city of Fort Collins. So I wanted to ask you about, you've talked a little bit about carbon emissions and impacts to homes in the line of fire, but a little bit about smoke and particle pollution. So that can affect, even from many states away or local, a lot of smoke in the air. So one of the things we think about in the climate resiliency conversation is how to better prepare people before a fire. Things like, is their home can they shut down the ventilation and that to not let the smoke in? But people ask things like, should I be in my car? So what kind of thing? Should I cancel this event? Should I go to that event? So I was wondering if you guys had any feedback about how a municipality could better provide outreach and information to a community about what they could do, promote awareness, and also just help people be ready for smoke impacts.
Okay. Russ?
It's a good question, Cassie. I don't know. You probably have better answers to this than I would. But I guess one thing I'd throw out there is that that's at least a positive, hopeful thing on this is that the ability to forecast where the smoke is going to be is a whole lot better now. Even in the last 5 years than I think was ever the case before. Partly just from better monitoring of where the fires are, but the models and satellite data and all that. So at least hopefully you have better information to start with, but yeah, in terms of those specific things of, what you tell people to do that, that is going to be beneficial. I don't know. I'm seeing Jacob, one of our grad students in the back there, looking intently on this conversation, and I wonder if he maybe has anything to chime in on.
Do you want to add anything,
that.
Jacob? This is your chance. Here. Stand up. Tell everybody who you are, too.
I really wanted to put him on the spot during this.
Thanks, Russ. Yeah, and I actually work with Cassie, so we sometimes chat about this, but we could always chat about it more, right? I am currently the chair of the Fort Collins Air Quality Advisory Board, yeah. So I am a graduate student at CSU, and I do research on what's in wildfire smoke, and we're trying to connect that. One of the goals of that is connecting that better to how it might affect our health when you breathe it in. One thing I've heard, I'll just add to this conversation, and I think Cassie was alluding to it here, is the idea of how do you create clean air spaces? Some people have called them clean air refuges or something along those lines. I think the public health community is trying to move to clean air spaces because it sounds nicer to be in. And there's a variety of different ways you can do that. And I think one thing Cassie might be asking about is, how do cities think about creating those kind of spaces and making them accessible, and also making the city populations kind of aware of what they might need to do in their own homes to do that. So yeah, I don't know, that's maybe a longer conversation to have, but.
Thanks for contributing. Okay. Any other questions? Did somebody answer that question, or we didn't get to it? I sort of got lost.
Not satisfactorily.
I have a quick question. So I have to go to this event after this, and I have to sort of act like I know a lot about fires now. So I want to ask you a question. Do we have a really strong sense about, how many fires, what's the percentage caused by humans, natural, is there any sort of if I go to the party and say, 90% of the fires are caused by humans, they'll go, you're a complete idiot. Only 5% are caused. Do you have any, what I just want to know. So, and that's totally
I should have looked that up. You can look that up.
Can you look it up?
Yes.
Oh. Like on Wikipedia or something, or what?
The National Interagency Fire Center, and NIFC, NIFC.gov will give you that answer.
Right.
And they also track all the wildfires by state and
Right.
by county and things like that.
So what's your warm, fuzzy feeling about that, though? Do you have, like, if you were going to bet, like, would you bet that there are more, like, I mean, we're in the Anthropocene, man. It's us, right?
Oh,
we
yeah.
all know this is
we
us,
love to start fires,
right?
yeah.
Yeah,
Well, I would say if you need something to add to the party, I had my fire behavior class this semester talk about, for their opener, I was like, well, what is the, give me a fire story that you had.
Yeah.
And almost everybody, especially college-age men, no offense to anyone, had these great stories about how they're lit something on fire. And it became this huge event, right? Whether that's crates or a tree by accident or maybe just a whole full can of gasoline, whatever it was. There were many of these. And so I was not surprised. You should not be surprised that a lot of fires are started by humans.
Right.
That there's some really amazing research that's actually shown that in some places, human populations and the presence of people overcome any climate drivers of fire ignitions, which is pretty incredible that we have this huge overarching climate thing happening and that's influencing how fires burn. But if you have a lot of people in a place, they're going to be more impactful on how fires burn. But in terms of X percentage across the United States.
But it begs that, we're in the Anthropocene. We're all trying to integrate human behaviors into our ecosystems. And I mean, clearly, this has some major force on driving, right? I mean, somehow, right? Not only climate change indirectly, but directly, the dude who throws a cigarette butt out the window or whatever, one of those things. So anyway, yeah.
At the same time, though, I think the Amazon being maybe the exception, but I think we've moved beyond the times where we just go and light, entire states on fire to clear land for agriculture or whatever.
Right.
So maybe in that sense, we're getting better at that.
Yeah.
But that's different from wildfires, obviously.
Right. Anyway, okay. Hey, listen. 85% how much? 85%. Jeez. See? It's all on us, man. What are you guys doing? Okay. Anyway. Okay. So listen. This was a great panel. Let's give the panel a hand. And let's give our high school students a hand too for coming tonight, participating. Okay, so thanks a lot, guys. Great job tonight. All of you look for the next panel in November, and we'll have that announced at Sustainability at Colo State. What did I do? Oh, okay. And everybody be safe going home and ride your bike and wear your helmet if you ride your bike. Okay, everybody have a nice night. See you.